All right, welcome to the Penguin Philosophy Podcast. This is Travis Pangburn. Today I'm speaking with Dinesh D'Souza. He is a best-selling author and filmmaker. His films, 2016 Obama's America and America Imagine a World Without Her, are respectively the number 2 and number 6 highest rated political documentaries of all time. D'Souza's latest feature-length film, Hillary's America, is widely credited with contributing to Hillary Clinton's defeat in 2016 and quickly joined his first 2 films in the top 10 political documentaries of all time. D'Souza's latest film, Death of a Nation, builds on this success and takes on, quote, progressive big lies, finally proving once and for all that the real party of fascism and racism is now and has always been the Democratic Party. Them's fighting words from a feisty man. Thanks for coming on today, Dinesh.
Hey, it's great. It's good to be on the show.
Awesome. So has the response to Death of a Nation lived up to your expectations?
It has. We have, the movie's been successful in the theater. It comes out in DVD very shortly. And, part of what I'm doing is contesting, I call them meta stories, which is large narratives about America and about society that have become embedded in our public discourse. The problem is that most people take these narratives to be fact, whereas in fact, they are the product of a progressive ideology that became predominant after World War II. So the textbooks are written by the progressives. These ideas are then refracted through the media and through Hollywood. And since people get them from all directions, they figure they've got to be true. And what I'm doing is contesting those narratives. And I do this both on the political, but also on the cultural and theological fronts.
Right. And would you say Hollywood is a bigger player in this or the media? How would you kind of quantify that?
Well, they all perform a different function. Academia is the factory for, you may say, manufacturing these narratives and supplying them with their scholarly respectability. The media then pushes them out in a kind of through commentary, through the History Channel, through NPR, National Public Radio. Hollywood converts these stories into narratives, into feature films. And so what happens is ultimately what concerns me is this is formulating people's opinion by cultivating prejudices, by giving people an idea that certain things must be true, even though the ordinary guy has no opportunity to actually skeptically scrutinize the basis for these claims. So these claims are things like fascism is on the right, or the Republican Party is the party of racism. And then these narratives, as I say, become embedded in the brain because you see them, you hear them in college, you see them in Barnes and Noble, you turn on the History Channel, there it is. And so you think you know it, but you don't know it because you don't actually know how that idea came to be. What is the actual support for it? That's what my movies contest. And look, I mean, I write the books and the movies because I'm using the same sort of, you may say, double whammy. I put my references in the books, but then I depict and dramatize the story through film.
Right. And I'm glad you brought up skepticism. There seems to be a massive failure across the board in teaching skepticism to children. Is this something you think is important for young kids?
Absolutely. And by the way, I think that skepticism should equally be the furniture of the, well, first of all, I think it should be the furniture of the political right as well as the left. But second of all, I think it should also be the intellectual furniture of the believer, the religious believer, no less than of the unbeliever. In fact, the reason we talk about religious belief as opposed to knowledge is because when you believe something to be true, you don't know it's true. You believe it, and you have to have some basis for believing it. So I once had a debate with Michael Shermer from Skeptic Magazine, and I told him, I'm a skeptic no less than you. I'm an agnostic no less than you, in the sense that both of us don't know. We haven't been to the other side of the curtain. We don't know what comes after death. We're both, in a sense, groping in the dark and using the candlelight of our intellect and our experience to try to make sense of something that it's inherently impossible to know for sure.
Right. Now, just touching on that for a bit, if there is something that we cannot know for sure, aren't there better ways to go about coming up with a probability of what probably is?
No. In other words, yes and no. Let's put it this way. If you were to tell me that there are two-headed people living in Papua New Guinea, we know right away that there is a mechanism for checking, even if the two of us don't go. We can listen to other people give us travel reports and so on, and we can attach a certain degree of probability, but that is based on our experiential knowledge of who those people are. The problem is that many questions in life aren't like that. So, for example, how did we get the world? Or I mentioned earlier, what comes after death? Now, think about how idiotic it is for someone to assign probabilities to something where experience doesn't reach at all. There is no way to assign those probabilities. Earlier in earlier generations, people tried to apply what they thought was a skeptical intellect. They would say things, for example, that, we have seen millions of white swans all over Europe, and therefore all swans are white because every iota of European experience confirms that swans are white. Then you set foot on the shores of Australia and you see the first black swan. And suddenly your whole, confirmed idea that all swans are white is shot. Why? Because here was something outside the narrow parameters of your experience. The fact that you didn't know it was there didn't mean it wasn't there. And your haste in attaching probabilities to something to which those probabilities don't apply ends up only, you may say, fortifying your ignorance.
Right. And
so you assert as a law something that is not a law.
Right.
So that's not a law. So we have to recognize that applies to our world too, no less than to the world of the ancient Greeks. Just because all their experience confirmed that there were a handful of stars in the sky didn't mean that they were actually correct about that experience.
Right. So I guess taking that all into consideration, if someone was to make the claim, do you believe that an afterlife exists, you would respond, I don't know?
Yes, I would respond, I don't know. Now, I would respond that in fact, none of us knows. We haven't been to the other side of the curtain. So we would have to try to figure out whether or not there is, first of all, the possibility of an afterlife. We would have to look at arguments from philosophy, from experience, near-death experiences, which may be the closest experiential clue to see if there is any possibility of consciousness surviving when the body does not. And we'd have to look at findings in modern physics and cosmology to see whether or not this concept of an alternative universe, you might say. Because after all, what is, at least the Christian concept of the afterlife, is an alternative universe. It is another realm outside, you may say, or transcending the realm of our universe in which other laws apply. And I would argue that modern cosmology has actually opened up this possibility, which wasn't there before.
Right. So as a skeptic, I would agree with you to say I don't know if someone asks me if there is an afterlife. But I would never make any kind of positive claim and say that or even say that I believe that an afterlife does exist. So I guess maybe I connect my beliefs to what I claim to know a little more closely than you would.
Well, let's test that though, because Travis, I'll ask you this question: do you believe in life on other planets?
Do I believe in life in other planets?
Well, do you believe, for example, that there could be, and maybe is, life in some other realm, some other planet, some other galaxy, some other star?
Sure.
Do you believe that?
Yeah, and the reason for that is because we have examples of life existing on a planet here.
Right, but what I'm saying is the fact that life exists here, so far as far as I can tell, there is no actual evidence that there is life anywhere else. And so your belief that there is life somewhere else, you would have to admit, is in that sense irrational. And by irrational, I mean that there's no strong evidence that would actually point your brain in that direction. But nevertheless, you are open to a possibility. Perhaps you even consider it a probability. So here's the point I want to make, and it's a philosophical rather than a scientific point. Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, made the point that where reason cannot go, it is not irrational to have faith. In other words, if we don't have a way of knowing whether there's life or not after death, it is no more reasonable to say that there is than there isn't, because you can't assign a probability based on reason. So the skeptic who says, There's no life after death who thinks that he's being somehow more rational than I am. He's not. He's deluded about the extent of where reason can travel. And here Kant's point applies, that before we have an argument based on reason, we have to demarcate the actual bounds of reason itself.
Right. I think the skeptic who's making a positive claim saying that there is no afterlife, is adopting the burden of proof. And I think that's a very slippery slope to go down when we cannot test this thing.
Exactly. And I think this is my argument with people like Dawkins and Dennett and so on, is that they believe that their profession of faith in a non-existence, you may say, of an afterlife is sort of more rational than the believer who says, I believe in life after death. They think that they're applying reason and we're not. And I'm simply saying, what reason are you applying? What evidence are you supplying for your position that is any stronger than the evidence I'm supplying for mine?
Yeah, I think a counter argument to that. I mean, my definition of faith typically is believing something when there's absent of any good reason to believe it. Am I just failing to define that properly?
Well, I would say this, that when it is possible to know, or where evidence applies, we should absolutely use evidence. But even in ordinary life, in virtually many, if not most of our decisions, we can apply evidence to a point. And beyond that, there is an element of faith. I mean, think of something as simple as, choosing the woman that you're going to marry. You're obviously going to plug in all the evidence you have about your life together, your dating experience, what her character is like, what the possibilities as best as you can envision them are going to be over the next, let's say, 30 years or more. But you have no way to know, in part because she's not going to be the same person 15 or 20 years from now than she is today. There's no way on a rational basis to settle the matter. There's going to be a leap of faith. And everybody knows this. And we take that leap of faith in all kinds of contexts. Somehow when it comes to religion, we somehow think it's different. And when we don't have proof, we should somehow not come to a conclusion. I think that the mathematician and philosopher Pascal was right. Most of life is lived in some sense in the void. Most of life involves applying scraps of reason and taking leaps of faith. And this is particularly true when you're talking about life lived forward as opposed to life simply viewed in the rearview mirror.
Yeah, I mean, when looking at relationship, I feel like we build like kind of a scientific model in a sense when we decide who we're going to hook up with or get together with or marry, and how much faith plays into that, I don't know. Like, I guess, I'm just speaking from my own experience. I'll do these calculations and see how it feels, and I don't ever know if before I marry someone, say, that things are going to work out. I'm basically just going through the process of being in a relationship, so I'm not sure that I'm applying any faith at all, because I wouldn't make the claim that we're going to be together forever or something like that.
Well, but you used a very telling phrase. You said, I see how it feels. And I think what you're saying in effect is that when let's say you made a chart and you put in her intelligence and you put in what you know about her character, you made a sort of equation or calculus about this. At the end of the day, you're going to ask a different set of questions. Things like, can I imagine life without this person? Or do I have a certain intuition that we connect at a certain level? Now, remember that those things are tapping into deep veins of intuition and feeling, which fall a little outside the bounds of pure rationality, at least rationality is applied in any systematic way. And that's all I'm trying to say. I think the same things apply in religious belief, that ultimately people, there's no religious person, for example, who doesn't have a deep intuitive sense that there is a God, who doesn't actually feel that they experience God in their ordinary life. So it is this experience attached to rationality that produces religious conviction. That's all. It's no different than any other sphere of life.
Interesting. So let's jump back to. So do you believe that the Democratic Party is still the party of slavery?
Of course not.
No.
The Democratic Party is still the party, I say, of the plantation. But what I mean by that is that the Democrats today have. See, let's remember that the slave plantation was an ethnic plantation. It wasn't just a bunch of guys enslaving a bunch of other guys. It was a bunch of white guys, for the most part, enslaving an exclusive population of black guys. So it was an ethnic plantation based upon dependency and based upon there's nowhere else to go. You're, in a sense, locked into this way of life, and the slave master provides all your needs. Now, I would argue today that that plantation philosophy remains, and the Democrats are running, you may call them multicultural plantations, ghettos for blacks, barrios for Latinos, reservations for Native Americans. So it's a different system than it was in the 1820s, but there is a thread of continuity. You still have ethnic groups that are essentially deposited into communities. They are still dependent on the Democratic Party for their livelihood. They are, in a certain sense, under mental rather than physical captivity. And the difference, of course, is that now it applies to many groups and not just to blacks.
Right. And are the Republicans to blame for any level of racism in the history of the U.S.?
Yes, although much less. In other words, I don't deny that racism became embedded in Western civilization starting in the era of discovery. I've written widely about this in my book, The End of Racism, many years ago. I also don't deny that there was racism in the North and the South, in the Republican and in the Democratic Party. Lincoln had to contend with racism among Northern Republicans, for example. But there's simply no comparison of magnitude. The Republican Party was the anti-racist party. It was the anti-slavery party. It was the party of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. It was the party that fought against the Ku Klux Klan. More Republicans voted for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 65, the Fair Housing Bill of 68, proportionally than Democrats did. So part of my point is that this history has been suppressed. It is not young. People don't know it. That's why when I talk about it on campus, they're blown away. They have to pull out their phone and check. The racist Dixiecrats did not become Republicans. The vast majority of them stayed and lived and died in the Democratic Party. So these are the kind of facts that I put in the movies. They're supported by documentation. And the only way to attack these arguments is to create straw men. Like I'm saying there's no racism in America. Or I'm saying that slavery is still going on. I don't say any of that nonsense. What I am saying, on the other hand, is that the worst crimes of bigotry in this country, not only slavery, but segregation, the founding and perpetuation of the Ku Klux Klan, lynching and racial terrorism, these were overwhelmingly perpetrated by one political party, namely the Democratic Party, and that's a fact.
Right. So you have recently been pardoned by President Trump. This was for pleading guilty to violating federal campaign finance laws in 2014. For those who don't know, was this expected, this pardoning? Did you know that this was coming?
Yes and no. It was not expected in the sense that I was not an original, you may say, Trumpster. I didn't endorse Trump in the primaries. I made a movie critical of Hillary, and so I kind of came on board to support Trump as the Republican nominee once he got the nomination. Debbie, my wife, and I are actually close to Ted Cruz. I now live in Texas. He's our senator. And it was Ted Cruz who posed the question, asked Trump if he would consider pardoning me. And Trump said, to actually quote Trump, done. And so Trump is the one that did it, but Cruz is the one who pressed him to do it.
Right. Great. And do you have any kind of relationship with Donald Trump? Like, do you know him personally?
None whatsoever. No, I don't know him. I've never met him. I spoke to him once before the second debate that he had with Hillary. I was with a friend who's close to Trump, and I was talking to them about questions that Trump could pitch to Hillary during the debate. And to my amazement, this guy pulled out his phone and called Trump and handed the phone to me. Wow. And so I got 5 minutes to talk to Trump. And that was my only conversation with Trump prior to getting the sort of official phone call from the White House notifying me about the pardon.
Right. Wow, that must have been something. And how would you, if you were to give Trump your most serious critique of his presidency thus far, what would that look like?
Well, I mean, Trump is. I think that he is a flawed man who is actually turning out to be a very good president. It's ironic because part of it is because of the time in which he's here. See, I think that there's been a gangsterization of the Democratic Party, and that's how we got Trump. Republicans nominated one Boy Scout after another, and the Democrats were able to turn them into Lucifer in 5 minutes. Perfect example is Romney, a very good man, but nevertheless a bit of an invertebrate. And the Democrats were able to demonize him. So the Republicans basically said, listen, if that's the case, then maybe we need a tough guy to take on the kind of tough tactics that we've now become familiar with. We saw them again with Kavanaugh. Again, a guy with an impeccable reputation, lovely family, couldn't have a more clean-cut record, and there was a sort of effort to politically assassinate him. That's how I interpret this latest scandal. It was essentially a political hit of the worst kind. Is Trump an egotist? Yes. Does he have an irresistible tendency to want to hit back, no matter how petty and picayune the person attacking him? Yes. But I think it's coming at a time when Republicans need that kind of feistiness. They need someone to hit back. And so I'm very glad we have Trump doing it. None of the other Republicans would be able to do what he's doing right now.
Well, it seemed like they couldn't even stand on stage with him when they were going through the debates before the election. Like he's a
street fighter, and he has that. Even though he's a billionaire, he has this kind of working class style. It's a New York style, and the wrong side of the tracks, New York style. And the Democrats aren't used to it. This is why he's thrown them off guard. So they are accustomed to handling a Republican like Pence. They're accustomed to handling the sort of a Republican like McCain. They know how to beat those people to a pulp. And when I say they, I don't just mean the Democratic Party. I mean the Democratic Party in coordination with Hollywood and the media. They know how to deal with the typical weak-kneed Republican. But Trump is unmanageable. And he's proven to be actually an extremely good street fighter. In fact, he uses the tactics of the left, which is ridicule, insult. He doesn't back down. And they're not used to being given a dose of their own medicine.
Right. Let's talk about Kavanaugh for a minute. I'm just going to start with your tweet that you sent out this morning. So you said, in retrospect, it's clear it was the media left that attempted to gang rape Kavanaugh. They sought to destroy his life, his dignity, and his reputation. He wasn't the perpetrator. He was the victim. Now, my follow-up question to that would be, could Kavanaugh and Ford both be a victim here of this political shit-slinging, essentially?
That is a possibility, but it's not a probability. Again, let's come back to let's weigh evidence. And the weighing of evidence here is not simply a matter of weighing Ford's word against Kavanaugh, just for the same reason that if somebody were to come out and say, Albert Einstein faked his equations, it's not simply a matter of he said, she said. We know Einstein. We actually would know his work. We would know his reputation. He has, in a sense, proven himself over a long period of time with a long procession of witnesses, competent witnesses, that he's worked with closely and so on. So here's the point. So that's the situation here. Here's a woman who comes out of nowhere. Right before the hearing, she scrubs all her social media, in a sense, which requires a lot of skill to do. She wipes clean her record. She hires a couple of shady Democratic lawyers and is working in close concert with the Democratic Party, strategic leaks and so on, all targeted, quickly picked up by the right magazines and blown up. And so in weighing this, again, you have to apply a certain skeptical lens equally to Ford and Kavanaugh. That never happened. The skepticism was applied in a one-way sense to Kavanaugh without applying the same investigations to Ford. Who looked at Ford's high school yearbook? Who looked to see what she was like? Whether she had a reputation for truthfulness, and so on. That was not done. So the basic idea is that Ford is not on trial. We shouldn't be doing this to Ford. She's merely the accuser. Kavanaugh's. So the hastiness of the Democrats in insisting that this is not a trial was a way of saying, let's not apply the normal rules of evidence. Let's not apply presumption of innocence. Let's not apply reciprocal skepticism. Let's just basically assume that what she said is completely true. And even though there's absolutely no corroboration, we created almost bogus standards of corroboration. In other words, if you made the accusation yourself to your husband 3 years ago, that's a confirmation that what you're saying is true. Even though, again, you're the only source for it in that instance as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Should Kavanaugh should there be legal repercussions for Ford if should there be an investigation to see if there was malice here, and should there be a some kind of charge?
Well, there's a high standard for making a charge against Ford. These events are a long time ago, but on the other hand, I don't think that one should, with impunity, be able to launch, you may say, an accusational missile that has the potential to completely destroy a man's life, utterly unsupported. So the reason for making an accusation would be if this is some kind of a left-wing conspiracy. In other words, if, for example, there was close targeted coordination between Ford and her lawyers and the Democrats, and if, for example, there was an attempt to get Kavanaugh, whether or not. See, I did a thought experiment the other day. I thought to myself, what if Kavanaugh goes down? And what if a year from now, Ford comes out and says, hey, I made the whole thing up. I have to confess, I pulled a fast one. What would the left say? There's a reasonably good chance that what they would say is, go Ford, fantastic. What a brilliant civil libertarian move. What an inspired tactical strike. So in other words, what struck me about this whole episode was the complete indifference to whether or not Ford's accusation was true. Even now with Michael Avenatti, the only reason the Democrats are mad at Avenatti is because they feel that he might have made a tactical blunder in overstating charges of gang rape. He went too far. Not that his charges were false, but that they didn't work.
Interesting. On November 29th in New York City, you'll be sitting down for a conversation with philosopher Matt Dillahunty, who is a prominent promoter of positive atheism and the separation of church and state. Matt was a fundamentalist Christian for 25 years and thought that he was supposed to be a preacher, but was able to find his way out of religion as he describes it. What do you expect to come of that conversation?
Well, I expect it to be a rich, textured, smart conversation that is interdisciplinary, that draws on many different fields and draws on our experience. In a sense, my journey is the reverse of Matt's. I grew up in India. My ancestors are converts to Christianity, but we practiced a very social, cosmetic type of Christianity. So I, you may say, discovered or rediscovered my faith in adult life. And so I think it's going to be interesting to have two guys who are very confident of their beliefs, but are on opposite sides, engage in the kind of debate that has unfortunately become extremely rare in the I missed it myself. I did a series of debates with Christopher Hitchens and some of the other atheists. I haven't done that in a while, so this is my stepping back into the arena. Looking forward to it, and I think it's going to be very lively.
Great. Do you like the fact that there is church-state separation in the U.S. Constitution, or would you change it if you had a chance?
Well, I think the core of this is what we mean by church-state separation. I mean, the concept of separating, you may say, church or religion and government is a deeply Christian idea. What else is the meaning of Jesus saying, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's? What is the meaning of that if not that we have completely separate duties to the state, i.e. Caesar, as we do to God, to the religious domain? There was a separation of church and state from the beginning of Christianity. Now, I agree that those lines were frequently blurred, but even in the Inquisition, if you were accused of a religious offense, you were tried by the church. If you were accused of a state offense, you were tried by the state. There were separate church courts, if you will, and state courts. And this is actually an invention of Christianity. If you go to Islam, for example, you just don't have that. Sharia law applies equally to the domains of church and state. So part of what I want to bring to Matt, and I don't know how this debate is going to go, is a sort of a recognition of the kind of ambiguity of these ideas. That sort of, if you say separation of church and state, and you think you've come up with some brilliant Enlightenment innovation that wasn't there in Christianity before, then you need a little bit of an historical education.
Interesting. Why? I'll just come out and ask this question. Why do you believe in God? And if so, why not Apollo or Thor instead of Yahweh?
The arguments for polytheism were arguments for taking, I may almost say, aspects of human nature and magnifying them into gods. Not human nature, but nature too. And so, for example, you have the river god and the god of lightning, the god of thunder, the god of the oceans, and so on. In that sense, gods functioned as, you may say, special types of surrogates for human beings. And this is partly why polytheism collapsed when it was confronted by the challenge of monotheism. It collapsed really all over the world, so that polytheism is not real today. We talk about Greek mythology, we can't take it seriously, even though the Greeks really did believe that there was a place called Mount Olympus somewhere on the earth, and that these gods did exist. We can't take that seriously today because we can see very clearly that polytheism is, you may say, a projection of human attributes. Now, that's not true of monotheism, and you have these astounding claims, for example, in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, that God made the world. And not only did God make the world, but he made the world, he created time along with the world. And think about that. This is an incredible statement that is made hundreds of years before Christ. And it's made by people with no access to any scientific experiments whatsoever. The idea that time itself is a property of the universe. This is stated, not only stated in the Bible, but then affirmed by a tradition of Christian interpretation of the and Jewish interpretation of those verses. And yet you would have to admit that this is a completely valid issue in modern cosmology. This is nothing that can be dismissed. We can't say, oh, gee, we've refuted that a long time ago. But that's just a bunch of nonsense. On the contrary, that is an extremely counterintuitive statement, astounding and inexplicable when it was made, that can actually be defended today with the best findings of modern astronomy, physics, and cosmology. And so anyway, the point is, to me, God is a reality in my life. The concept of God makes sense as an explanation for a universe that doesn't have any other explanation. And so to me, it's a confluence of arguments, historical, philosophical, and scientific, that support the idea of a creator.
Right. So I agree that the stories are interesting, and I'm a big fan of all kinds of myths. But the spot where I find hard to go to is that, I mean, the Bible, for example, was written by human beings and who claim to be divinely inspired. And why do people trust that they were divinely inspired in the right way, or that they were divinely inspired at all?
They don't. In other words, look, at the time of early Christianity, there were literally innumerable texts, all purporting to be divinely inspired. So it's not as if the Christians said, oh, gee, Fred, you say you're divinely inspired. Okay, you got to go in the Bible. That's nonsense. I mean, there was a deep process of examination that actually lasted 300 years. The Bible as we know it, and the basic Christian doctrines as we know them, weren't consolidated until 400 years after Christ, and involved a discriminatory process of examination and debate, both philosophical and theological, over a long period of time. So unless you at the outset reject the possibility of divine inspiration, and I think that is actually a mistaken thing to do, because many people who we would consider secular, I mean, Emerson, for example, poets, have always talked about the idea of a muse. And what they mean by a muse is that there is an inspiration that can somehow come to us from the outside, rather than being generated entirely from the. So unless you dismiss all of this, dismiss all of art, all of literature, as somehow being nothing more than something that you may say defies external explanation, but even a creative person in the scientific domain would have to admit, the idea came to me, as opposed to I generated the idea, and our deep sense that ideas come to us, I think, opens up the possibility of transcendence. In other words, transcendence is not an exclusive prerogative of religion. It was there in philosophy, and it's always been there in the arts.
Right. So the idea of ideas coming to us, like I get that concept. It's very biological because, our nervous system and the way we experience and the thoughts that come into our mind, we're kind of the last to know about them, the way our neurological system works and our brain works. But I'm still having problems. So after like 400 years, you need to believe that the authors were in fact divinely inspired. Now that's where faith comes in, right?
Well, faith comes in asserting that. See, obviously, if someone says I'm divinely inspired, they're making a claim based on authority. They're saying God told me, in effect. And I'm not saying that someone who ordinarily says that should be believed. I'm not saying that we should just take it on faith, you might say. Because if so, you'd have to take on faith, every sage and Hare Krishna and every guy who says God told me to do this or God told me to do that. Now, it's important to realize that neither religion nor philosophy have ever been based on that. Philosophy always begins in piety. If you look at the Republic, it begins with someone asserting something canonically. This is the way it is. And the Socratic process then begins by saying, how do we know? What do you mean by that? What do you mean by justice? What do you mean by truth? But Socrates never questions the fact that there is such a thing as justice and there is such a thing as truth. And so if you were to tell Socrates, by the way, Socrates, there's really no such thing as truth. There are neurons firing in your brain. And as a result, it is those chemical transactions that cough up this notion of truth. But that's your truth. And it's not necessarily somebody else's truth. And there's no way of going beyond your neurons versus my neurons and coming to some understanding of truth itself. I think, that is where you actually fall into a mechanistic description of truth that is not that doesn't actually do justice to truth itself. Imagine if we were to look at justice that way. It's nothing more than the firing of neurons in our brain. Then I would say, well, who cares about civil rights? What makes those things? What makes that something that society cherishes and is actually willing to impose by the force of law? If a restaurant says I'm not going to allow gay people to eat here, we go into that restaurant and force them to do it. So we're assuming that there is a moral principle here that has, you may say, transcendent value. It doesn't matter whether or not your neurons are in sync with it. No one cares. No one cares whether you agree with it. It's going to be imposed on you one way or the other because it is and we don't even care if the majority rejects it. That's why we have courts to affirm them as, you may say, constitutional principles. So on what basis can you assert these principles as true without granting to them some transcendence that goes beyond human subjectivity?
Interesting. Do you ever worry about religions going too far, including Christianity or Catholicism, as far as genital mutilation, anti-homosexuality rhetoric, prayer being the top priority in the wake of tragedy? Do you see these all as major issues?
Well, yes, I certainly think that there is whenever someone purports to have the truth, they can try to impose that by force. And historically, we know that was done very commonly. And it was done by the Catholics. It was done by the Protestants. It's, of course, being done today by radical Muslims. But I think we have to be equally aware that the denial of truth, nihilism, also produces genocidal results. In fact, the greatest perpetrators of human evil, certainly in modern times, have not been religious believers. They've been atheists. And this would be true of Mao. It would be true of Stalin. It would be true of Hitler. Hitler wasn't an atheist per se, but he certainly was a despiser of Christianity. And the roots of his fanaticism and his genocide was ultimately in a certain reading of Darwin's philosophy of the survival of the fittest.
Right. And one thing I would say to that is that I don't think you can really do anything terrible or good in the name of atheism because it's just the rejection of a claim. But are you saying that just being in that position on that claim, it can lead you to stuff like doing bad things?
Yeah, see, I don't think you're actually thinking through the atheist premise clearly enough, because let me push it for a little bit, okay?
Sure.
Atheism is not. You could say that agnosticism is a certain kind of lackadaisical position of I don't know, and since I don't know, I'm not going to take a stand one way or the other. Now, I think agnosticism is realistic. It's unrealistic in life because we frequently have to choose whether or not we know for sure. But nevertheless, the agnostic has always historically been a kind of an inert character. Burke made the point that typically these guys are sort of the dropouts of society. Now, I take atheism to be one step beyond agnosticism, because the atheist is ultimately making positive claims, things like there is no God. If the atheist doesn't say there is no God, then to me, it doesn't make any sense to call yourself an atheist. You're not. An atheist is someone who's actually asserting that as far as he's concerned or she's concerned, there is no God. And as far as he or she is concerned, there is no life after death. And these are important practical assertions because you live your life according to that. So you're betting your life on it. You're betting your life that when you die, that's the end. And so you're voting even though you're pretending not to vote. Now, the question is, what's the philosophical significance of that? And I would simply say that quite apart from outliers like Mao and Pol Pot, take a philosopher like Nietzsche, who thought through his atheism and said to himself, if there is no God, then all the Christian values of compassion, love your neighbor, everybody has equal dignity. He goes, all of that is the shadows of God. All of that's nonsense. If there is no God, where'd that come from? Why should we affirm that? We're Darwinian creatures in the world, and ultimately this is a brutal struggle for power, just as it is in the natural world. And why should it be any different in the human world? And why should we take the powerful urge to dominate, subjugate, and destroy other people and treat that as though we've somehow refuted that, as though we've got some kind of a moral principle to trump that? What moral principle? Where'd that moral principle come from? So this is what I would call serious atheism. One of the reasons my debates with Hitchens were the high point of my debates on theological topics is he understands this. He's one of these atheists who recognizes that when you strip away God, the dark side of human nature is thereby liberated, and there's nothing to stop it. And Nietzsche recognized that, and this is why Nietzsche actually despised the atheists of his time, whom he regarded as shallow and unserious, because he thought they didn't think through the implications of the death of God.
Okay. So I spent a lot of time with a lot of atheists, and with Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins being the most prominent ones, and at least in the people that I've ever spoken to, I've never heard them describe atheism the way that you're describing it. So maybe the definitions are getting in the way here. Kind of what you're calling agnosticism is what they're calling atheism, in that, the atheist position is, if someone makes a claim this God exists, my response would be, okay, I'd like to see the evidence. And then if there is no evidence, the atheist position is just to not believe that claim. So that's
But see, that's not. You see, here's the problem with that approach to me, and it's this. It's kind of like if I'm dating a woman and I'm thinking about whether I should propose, and I say to myself, you know what? She's got some good qualities. She's got some bad qualities. But if I'm trying to envision what life with her is going to be like, let's just say over the next 10 or 20 years, there's no way for me to do that. I can't know for sure. Therefore, I'm going to wait. I'm going to wait for the data to come in before I make a decision. Well, the truth of it is she's going to go marry someone else or tell me to at some point take a hike. She will take my abstinence as a no vote. Why? Because that is the practical significance of what I'm saying. Because I know the data will never be in. I'll never know for sure. And so I'm voting no, but pretending to vote maybe. And so to me, that's a fake. It's a fake because in life, we actually have to live our life based upon choices we commit to, even when we don't know for sure. I mean, here we are, we're flung into the world. We don't know how we got here, why we're here, what the purpose of our life is, or what's going to come after death. We don't know, and it may be that we'll never know. And that being the case, all intelligent people nevertheless have to live a life that grapples with those questions and makes certain bets based on them. So if someone literally tells me, gee, since I don't know, I'm going to take the position that there's nothing there and live my life based upon it, but I'm not really saying that there's nothing there because ultimately I'm merely suspended in its kind of indifference. I think that reflects an unwillingness to recognize that the skepticism of philosophy has got to be married to the dogmatism of action. In the end, we have to live our life based upon choices that we make, and the choice ultimately is a yes or no. Just like when you go into the presidential box, you can't say, gee, I don't really know what kind of President Trump is going to be, and since I don't really know, I'm going to kind of keep waiting until I figure it out. No, on election day, you have to vote, and our life is like election day.
Well, I would say if we were in this vacuum and I did have to pick a yes or no, I would have to pick no because I haven't seen any evidence for the existence of any gods.
Right, but look, part of it, I think maybe that we disagree about what we mean by evidence, and here's what I'm getting at. If you're a character in a play, let's just say Hamlet, you could be looking for internal evidence. In other words, you're looking, for example, to see why Polonius did this and why Ophelia did that. You're inside the play. And if I come to you and I say to you, listen, this whole play, Hamlet, was created by this guy, William Shakespeare. And you're saying, well, I'm Hamlet. I don't really see it. I'm in the play. I don't see Shakespeare. I only see Ophelia. I only see Polonius. I only see the acts that are occurring inside the play. And I can't get my head around the idea that some other guy, Shakespeare, actually made this whole play. So when we're looking for causality and we're looking for evidence, we have to be open to that kind of evidence. In other words, an evidence that supplies an explanation that is of a slightly different kind than the efficient causal explanations that science typically looks for.
Well, this is going to be a really interesting event. I'm really looking forward to it. I think you and Matt are going to have one of the most important conversations, I think, in the past maybe 10 years on this subject. So I'm really looking forward to it. Everyone can go to pangburnphilosophy.com if they are interested in coming to the event and getting tickets. I wanted to touch on racism quickly, Dinesh, and specifically anti-white racism. I've been running a lot of polls and different questions on social media, different social media platforms, and asking people. It seems like 50% of the people on this planet don't believe that you can actually be racist towards a white person. How do you feel on this?
Well, the people who say that you can't be racist toward a white person have accepted a kind of leftist a definition of what racism is. Their definition is that racism is prejudice plus power, and that white people have historically had the power, and that white people have been racist by combining their prejudices against non-white people with their ability to harm them, discriminate against them, lynch them, and so on. According to this doctrine, the reverse doesn't apply. Why? Because blacks and Hispanics can have prejudices. They may not like white people for whatever reason, but they don't have the power to implement those beliefs. So this is the theory behind the idea that that only white people can be racist and minorities cannot be racist against whites. To me, this is nonsense. Not because the definition of racism is wrong. I agree with it. You need prejudice as well as power. But I think that in reality, the minority activists today are far more powerful than the so-called white nationalists. I mean, if you look at Charlottesville, for example, the ragtag white nationalists in Charlottesville have absolutely no power. They don't have any political power. They don't have any cultural power. If the Ku Klux Klan were to have a rally, they'd be lucky to get 50 people and there'd be 500 people protesting them. By contrast, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, these kinds of groups have prejudices and they have enormous power. They have power not only because they have support in the Democratic Party, but they have support in the media. They have support in Hollywood. In Berkeley, for example, the mayor of Berkeley, Jesse Aragon, was, if he not still is, a member of an Antifa Facebook group. He's the guy who calls off the cops. He's the guy that allows these thugs to run loose in Berkeley and and also we see the same thing in places like Portland. These are people who actually do have prejudices and power. And so for this reason, I think the notion that somehow they can't be racist is incorrect.
Yeah, and I mean, it seems like SWAT doesn't show up when Antifa shows up. Like, they don't treat this like a riot, but I see these when Antifa shows up to do this violence. I see this as more of a riot than I do a peaceful protest.
Well, this is the thing. Recently on CNN, one of the hosts was getting very angry at the phrase, mob justice. What do you mean by mob justice? Well, it's one thing for people to protest. It's another thing to, gang up on someone in an elevator, chase Brian Kilmeade to Fox News in the subway. There's an attempt here to terrorize, to intimidate, and it's this that we're reacting against. It's this that ultimately is undemocratic, because it is the enemy of free and open debate. If I have some common ground with the so-called new atheists, it's that it is that all of us have a certain suspicion of political correctness. We welcome genuine skepticism, and whichever side of the aisle we fall on at the end, we favor a process of vigorous argument, challenging ideas, and not trying to ultimately beat someone into submission to your point of view.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on that. We need more people supporting free speech and intellectual discourse from all sides of the political spectrum. So let's finish on this question. I always finish with my guess on this. What is the biggest ideological threat to humanity?
The biggest ideological threat to humanity, I think, is the idea that we have a right to some other guy's labor. When Lincoln defined slavery in the 1850s, he described slavery this way: "You work, I eat." So interestingly, for Lincoln, slavery wasn't fundamentally about race. It was theft. One guy works, and another guy takes the product of his labor, appropriates it to himself. And to Lincoln, this was the fundamental moral wrongness of slavery. And in theory, you could have white slavery based on the same principle. So I think what happens now is we keep hearing about social justice worldwide. And what the left basically says in social justice is we want social justice. To me, social justice is I get to keep what I earn, and you get to keep what you earn. If you're going to claim the fruits of my labor, you're stealing from me. And that principle, I think, is I don't know if it is the most serious threat, but it's destroying countries like Venezuela right now. It was a great threat to the world in the 20th century before the collapse of the Soviet Union. It is a pernicious idea. It's very powerful in this country and throughout the industrialized West. So if I had to pick a candidate off the top of my head, I think I'd pick the perverted philosophy that you work and I get to eat the fruits of your labor.
Right. Well, Dinesh, thank you so much for coming on today. I really appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure.
Everyone, again, it's on November 29th in New York City. This will be Dinesh D'Souza and Matt Dillahunty having a conversation. This is going to be electric. Don't miss that one. You can go to penguinphilosophy.com for tickets. And as always, let art and science inspire. Thank you.